Before I tell you the first story, I need to say this clearly. I've planned weddings for people whose combined net worth could fund a small country. And money changes the emotional physics of a room. When a wedding is paid for without limits, it stops being a celebration and starts becoming a negotiation. And nowhere does that show itself more brutally than when a mother-in-law decides that generosity means ownership. I'm Emily Carter. I've spent years behind the scenes of luxury weddings, watching what families don't realize they're revealing. The contracts, the deposits, the guest lists, the quiet conversations that happen when the couple leaves the room. And the truth is, some of the most beautiful weddings I've ever planned were also the most emotionally violent. The first couple I want to talk about came to me with a vision that was almost disarmingly simple, especially given who they were: Abigail Monroe and Harrison Whitmore. They were both polished, private, and deeply aware of the world they came from. Harrison's family was old money, the kind that doesn't need to announce itself because everyone already knows. Abigail wasn't intimidated by that, but she was cautious. When they sat across from me during our first meeting, they didn't talk about spectacle, they talked about intimacy. They wanted a weekend that felt personal: close friends, immediate family, no performances. They chose a historic oceanfront estate in Newport, Rhode Island: stone terraces, salt air, a ceremony timed perfectly with the sunset. The kind of place that feels grand without feeling loud. From the beginning, Abigail kept repeating one phrase, almost like a quiet promise to herself. We want to recognize everyone in the room that mattered to her. Then Eleanor Whitmore entered the process. Harrison's mother didn't attend the first meeting. She didn't need to. Instead, she sent an email that was impeccably polite and breathtakingly efficient. She would be covering the full cost of the wedding: venue, vendors, accommodations, transportation, everything. She framed it as a relief, as a kindness, as a way to let the couple focus on love instead of logistics. I've learned to read between lines like that. When someone offers full funding without asking a single question, it's rarely about easing stress. It's about removing friction. At first, Eleanor stayed at a distance. She approved contracts quickly. No haggling, no revisions. Vendors were stunned. The catering company told me they'd never seen a mother move money that fast. The florist joked that it felt like planning a gala, not a wedding. And that was the first quiet shift. I noticed that when vendors spoke about decisions, they started referencing Eleanor's preferences instead of the couple's. Not overtly. Just small phrasing changes. Eleanor mentioned she prefers a larger reception flow. Eleanor asked if we could hold some flexibility. When I brought this up to Abigail, she smiled tightly and said it was fine. She didn't want to seem ungrateful. Harrison nodded. He'd grown up inside this dynamic. To him, this was normal gravity. The guest list was where the tension first surfaced. Abigail and Harrison had capped it at 120 people. That number was deliberate. They wanted conversations, not handshakes. I submitted the list to the venue and vendors, locked in counts, and everything moved smoothly, until a week later, I received an updated guest spreadsheet directly from Eleanor's assistant. It included 47 additional names: executives, board members, spouses, people I recognized from corporate events, not family gatherings. There were notes beside some names: dietary accommodations, seating preferences, arrival times. I remember staring at the file and feeling my stomach drop. When I called Eleanor to clarify, she sounded genuinely surprised that I was confused. She explained that these were long-standing relationships, people who had supported Harrison's father's legacy, people who expected to be included. She spoke as if she were correcting an oversight, not rewriting the event. I told her the couple had intentionally limited the guest count. There was a pause. Not an angry one. A calculating one. She said, very calmly, that the estate could handle more people, that the catering budget already allowed for flexibility, and that she'd taken the liberty of adjusting certain vendor agreements to accommodate the expansion. It was all taken care of. No inconvenience. After everything she'd done, she said, "This hardly seemed like a problem." That phrase landed heavy. When I relayed the conversation to Abigail and Harrison, the room went quiet. Abigail asked if the contracts could be reversed. I told her the truth. Eleanor had signed amendments. She had authority as the payer. Vendors were now legally obligated to her instructions. Harrison rubbed his face and said his mother always did this. She solved problems by creating facts. Abigail didn't cry. She got very still. She asked whether they would still have time with their friends during the reception, whether speeches could be limited, whether they could avoid being pulled into conversations with people they didn't know. I told her I would try, but I already knew what this was becoming. Because when a wedding starts accommodating people who aren't there for the marriage, it stops belonging to the couple. It becomes a stage. And stages demand performances. Over the next few weeks, subtle changes kept appearing. A revised reception timeline that included additional speaking slots, a longer cocktail hour designed for networking, branded welcome materials that felt more corporate than celebratory. Each time I pushed back, I was met with the same smooth resistance. Everything was already approved. Everything was already paid for. Eleanor framed each change as an upgrade, a benefit, a favor. And each time, Abigail and Harrison were forced to choose between confrontation and compliance. They chose silence. By the time the wedding weekend arrived, the estate looked less like a celebration and more like an exclusive summit. Security was heightened. Vendors deferred exclusively to Eleanor's assistant. The seating chart resembled a power map. On the morning of the ceremony, Abigail pulled me aside. She asked me, very quietly, whether it was normal to feel like a guest at your own wedding. I didn't have an answer that would make her feel better, because what Eleanor had built wasn't chaos. It was control, precise, elegant, and nearly invisible to anyone who didn't know where to look. And the most devastating part was this: the guests, Eleanor added, believed they were honored. They believed this was what the couple wanted. What happened next didn't stay behind the scenes. It unfolded in front of everyone, and it changed how the room saw the woman who thought she owned it. By the time the ceremony ended and the sun dropped into the Atlantic, there was a brief moment where it almost felt like the couple had reclaimed something. Abigail walked back down the aisle, holding Harrison's hand a little tighter than planned, smiling at faces she actually recognized. For a few minutes, it looked like a wedding again. That illusion didn't last long. The boundary wasn't tested with confrontation. It was tested with assumptions. During cocktail hour, I noticed Eleanor positioning herself near the bar, greeting arrivals like a host at a private fundraiser. She wasn't loud. She didn't need to be. People came to her naturally, thanking her for the invitation, complimenting the venue, asking about Harrison's work. Every conversation subtly circled back to her. When the first tray of champagne went out, Eleanor waved over the catering manager and reminded him to prioritize a specific group near the terrace. These were her guests. She didn't say it explicitly, but everyone understood. The servers adjusted without question. I intercepted the catering manager afterward and reminded him that the couple had requested equal service flow. He apologized, genuinely uncomfortable, and told me Eleanor had already clarified expectations directly with his team weeks earlier. That's when I realized something important. She wasn't reacting in the moment. She had planned this. The reception schedule was the next pressure point. Originally, there were 2 speeches before dinner. One from Abigail's father and one from Harrison's best friend. Short, emotional, personal. I'd confirmed it repeatedly. As guests were ushered into the ballroom, Eleanor's assistant handed me an updated program. There were now 5 speeches. 2 of them were from people I didn't recognize. When I asked who they were, Eleanor answered for me. Longtime family associates, mentors, people who had been instrumental in shaping Harrison's future. She smiled as she said it, as if she were gifting the room insight into a legacy. I told her, quietly but firmly, that the couple had not approved additional speakers. She tilted her head and said she assumed they would be grateful. These people had flown in specifically. It would be rude to deny them a moment. Besides, she added, the evening schedule had already been adjusted. That word again? Already. I found Abigail near the restroom hallway, smoothing her dress with shaking hands. When I explained what was happening, she closed her eyes for a second longer than normal. Then she asked me if stopping it would cause a scene. I told her the truth. It probably would. She nodded and said, then let it happen. Harrison reacted differently. When he learned about the speeches, he went straight to his mother. I didn't hear the conversation, but I watched it. The way Eleanor's posture didn't change. The way Harrison's shoulders slowly lowered as if the argument was draining out of him. When he walked away, he didn't look angry. He looked resigned. Dinner unfolded like a choreographed event. Plates timed to the minute. Wine poured with almost mechanical precision. And then the speeches began. The first unfamiliar speaker talked about partnerships, growth, and shared vision. Words you hear in boardrooms, not at weddings. The second referenced Harrison's future responsibilities, his family name, and the importance of maintaining relationships. Abigail sat perfectly still beside her husband, smiling when she was expected to smile. I could see her jaw tightening between applause. Guests started noticing. Not everyone, but enough. There's a moment at every wedding when the room collectively decides what kind of event it is. This room was shifting. People whispered. A few of Abigail's friends exchanged looks. Someone near the back muttered that it felt like a corporate dinner. Eleanor watched it all with satisfaction. After the final speech, she stood briefly, raised her glass, and thanked everyone for celebrating this union and everything it represents. It was a carefully chosen phrase, broad enough to mean anything or nothing. That was the boundary test. Not asking permission. Not seeking agreement. Simply acting as if the authority was hers by default and daring anyone to challenge it publicly. And the most painful part was that challenging her didn't just risk embarrassment. It risked unraveling the entire event. Every vendor, every timeline, every carefully paid-for detail now depended on her goodwill. As the music started and guests moved toward the dance floor, Abigail leaned toward me and whispered, "Is it going to stay like this all night?" I looked across the room at Eleanor, already pulling another vendor aside, already adjusting something that didn't belong to her. And I knew the answer. Because once boundaries are tested and nothing pushes back, control doesn't pause, it accelerates. As the night went on, Eleanor stopped pretending that she was a guest. She moved through the reception like an executive walking a factory floor. Checking details, redirecting staff, making decisions that should have belonged to the couple. And because she had paid for everything, no one stopped her. The escalation wasn't dramatic at first. It was procedural. She adjusted the seating flow so her guests stayed clustered near the head tables, ensuring proximity to Abigail and Harrison during dinner. She instructed the photographer to capture more group legacy shots, as she called them, pulling Harrison away repeatedly to stand beside people he barely knew. Each time, Abigail was left alone at the table, smiling politely at empty space. I remember catching the photographer's eye and shaking my head slightly. He looked apologetic but helpless. Eleanor had signed his revised contract. Her requests carried weight. Then came the reception timeline. The band was scheduled to open the dance floor with the couple's first dance, followed immediately by an open floor to shift the energy from formal to celebratory. It was something Abigail cared deeply about. She wanted joy to take over before the night became stiff. Instead, Eleanor delayed it. She told the bandleader to hold while a few more guests arrived from the terrace. Those guests happened to be her guests. The delay stretched from 5 minutes to 15. The energy in the room cooled. People drifted back to their seats. Conversations resumed. When Abigail asked me why the music hadn't started, I could see the frustration cracking through her calm. I told her what happened. She stared across the room at Eleanor, who was laughing with a group of men in tailored suits, completely unbothered. Harrison noticed it too. This time, when he approached his mother, his voice was firmer. I stood close enough to hear fragments. He said this was their wedding, that the schedule mattered, that they wanted to dance. Eleanor didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. She reminded him that many of the guests had traveled extensively, that they deserved a proper experience, and that rushing the evening would feel ungracious. She said she was protecting him, protecting the family's image. Then she said something I'll never forget. She told him that after everything she'd invested, it would be embarrassing for the night to feel poorly managed. Invested, not given. Not gifted, invested. Harrison went quiet. He stepped back, nodded once, and walked away without another word. The band waited. By the time the first dance finally happened, the moment felt diluted. People clapped politely. Phones were out, but the spark was gone. Abigail held herself together through the song, but when it ended, she excused herself and went outside. I followed her. She stood on the stone terrace overlooking the water, the sound of waves barely cutting through the noise behind us. She asked me if this was what rich weddings always looked like from the inside. She asked me if anyone ever said no. I told her that some people do, but it usually costs them more than money. Inside, Eleanor continued tightening her grip. She directed staff to extend the formal dinner service, shortening open dancing. She added an impromptu dessert presentation that required guests to remain seated. Every adjustment pushed the evening further away from intimacy and deeper into performance. Guests felt it now. Whispers turned into comments. A few people quietly left early. One of Abigail's bridesmaids asked me outright who was actually running the wedding. The answer was painfully obvious. And then Eleanor crossed the line that made it impossible to ignore. She announced an unscheduled toast. No warning, no consultation. She took the microphone, thanked the room again, and spoke about legacy, responsibility, and the importance of honoring those who make success possible. She never mentioned Abigail by name, not once. The room went still. This wasn't just control anymore. It was erasure. Abigail heard it from outside. She returned just as the toast ended, her face composed but pale. When she sat back down, she didn't reach for Harrison's hand. That was the moment the wedding stopped being theirs in any meaningful way, and the people in the room knew it. Because control, when taken that far, doesn't stay invisible. It announces itself. It demands witnesses. There's a shift that happens when a room realizes it's been misled. At first, guests assume they're missing context. Then they assume it's intentional. And finally, they understand exactly who is in charge. That understanding spread quietly through the ballroom, like a temperature change you can't see, but everyone feels after Eleanor's toast. People stopped pretending this was a wedding about two people starting a life together. Conversations changed. Abigail's friends clustered closer to her, creating a kind of protective orbit. Harrison's colleagues leaned toward Eleanor, thanking her, congratulating her, reinforcing the very power she was displaying. The divide became visible. During what should have been open dancing, the floor stayed half empty. Guests hesitated, unsure whether this was the right moment to let loose. The band played anyway, trying to revive something that had already slipped away. Then, something small happened that made everything unmistakably public. One of Eleanor's business associates approached Abigail directly. He congratulated her, complimented the venue, and then said, with complete sincerity, that Eleanor had done an extraordinary job hosting such an impressive event. Abigail smiled, thanked him, and nodded. But when he walked away, her hands were shaking. I saw other guests notice it too, the wording, the implication, the quiet transfer of credit. Later, near the bar, I overheard two of Abigail's relatives whispering that it felt like Harrison's mother had thrown herself a party and invited a bride and groom as accessories. They weren't being malicious, they were confused. And confusion at a wedding is rarely kind. Eleanor, meanwhile, seemed energized by the attention. She made rounds, accepting praise with practiced grace. She spoke about the estate, the logistics, the planning, as if she'd personally orchestrated every detail. When someone asked about the ceremony, she redirected the conversation to the reception's scale and execution. I watched Harrison witness this from across the room. For the first time all night, he didn't look resigned. He looked embarrassed. That's the thing about public consequences. They don't just expose the person being controlled, they expose the person doing the controlling, too. By the time cake was served, the energy had shifted from AEW to discomfort. Guests clapped politely. Conversations softened. People started checking their watches. Eleanor noticed it. I know she did. But instead of pulling back, she leaned in. She corrected a server loudly for placing a plate incorrectly. She interrupted a conversation Abigail was having to redirect her to another guest. Each move was small, but together they painted a very clear picture. This was her event, and everyone could see it. The final moment came when the photographer gathered the couple for what should have been their last private shots of the night. Eleanor stepped into the frame uninvited and instructed him to take a few group photos instead. She positioned herself beside Harrison, adjusted his jacket, and told Abigail to stand slightly to the other side so the lighting would be balanced. No one laughed, no one objected. Cameras clicked. That image would exist forever. Abigail held her posture until the photographer lowered his camera. Then she turned to me and asked, quietly, whether we could leave early. Not sneak away, not escape, just leave. When the bride asks to exit her own wedding before it ends, the damage is already done. Guests noticed the early departure. Whispers followed them as they walked out together, hands linked but shoulders tense. Eleanor stayed behind, continuing to receive compliments, continuing to act as if nothing unusual had happened. But the room knew. And Eleanor knew, the room knew, because control thrives in private, but it rarely survives public awareness without consequence. What happened after the lights dimmed and the estate emptied didn't involve shouting or dramatic confrontations. It was quieter than that, and in many ways more lasting. After the wedding, there was no explosion, no dramatic confrontation, no ultimatums delivered in raised voices. That's what surprises people the most. The real damage didn't show up until the silence set in. In the weeks that followed, Abigail stopped answering Eleanor's messages. Not deliberately at first, she just didn't have the energy. Every text carried an undertone. Every "hope you're resting" felt like a reminder of who had paid for what. Harrison tried to smooth things over, like he always had, but something in him had shifted too. When we met for a final debrief, Abigail told me she couldn't look at the wedding photos yet. She said it felt like flipping through someone else's event. Someone else's priorities. Someone else's voice. That image of Eleanor stepping into the frame, adjusting her son, repositioning the bride, became symbolic. Not because it was shocking, but because it was honest. It showed exactly where the power had been standing all along. Harrison struggled in a quieter way. He didn't defend his mother anymore, but he didn't confront her either. He started noticing how often she framed support as sacrifice, how often everything I've done followed any disagreement. The wedding hadn't created the pattern, it had simply exposed it under bright lights. Eleanor, for her part, never apologized. She talked about the wedding as a success. She mentioned how impressed people were, how smoothly everything ran. She never acknowledged the early exit, never mentioned Abigail's absence from the final hours. In her version of events, nothing had gone wrong, and that was the final realization. Some mothers don't measure success by their children's happiness. They measure it by how much authority they maintained while appearing generous. Abigail eventually told Harrison something that stayed with me. She said she finally understood that the wedding wasn't the beginning of the problem, it was the proof of what would happen every time money entered the room without boundaries. They didn't cut Eleanor off. They didn't make dramatic declarations. They did something quieter and far more difficult. They stopped accepting large gifts. They paid for things themselves, even when it meant smaller choices. They stopped sharing plans before decisions were made. They learned that autonomy, once compromised, is expensive to reclaim. And Eleanor noticed distance, when it's intentional, feels like disrespect to someone who believes money buys proximity. Before we move on, I want to ask you something. If someone pays for your wedding, where do you think the line actually is? At the guest list, the speeches? Or does the control really start the moment you say yes to the money? Because the next story takes this idea even further. In the next wedding, the money didn't arrive all at once. It came in pieces, carefully timed, strategically delayed, and every missed deposit came with a reminder that the entire celebration could disappear overnight. And I need you to think about this as we go into it. If your wedding could be canceled at any moment unless you complied, how many of your boundaries would survive? When people think about financial control at weddings, they usually imagine someone paying for everything up front and then demanding obedience. What they don't talk about enough is the kind of control that comes from uncertainty, from never knowing whether the money will arrive, from planning a wedding that feels like it could collapse at any moment. That was the situation Lily Harrington and Nathaniel Brooks walked into. I met them at a vineyard resort in Napa Valley, the kind of place that looks effortless but runs on precision. Every detail there is timed, priced, and dependent on deposits landing exactly when promised. Lily knew that she was meticulous, organized, the kind of bride who kept spreadsheets color-coded. Nathaniel was calmer, trusting. He believed things would work out because, in his world, they usually did. His mother, Vivian Brooks, made sure of that. At least, that's how it appeared at first. Vivian positioned herself as supportive, almost hands-off. She told the couple she wanted them to have the wedding they deserved. She said she would cover the costs but preferred to pay vendors directly, in stages, to keep everything clean and organized. She framed it as responsible, smart, protective. I've heard that explanation before. From the outside, it looked generous. From behind the scenes, it introduced a dangerous variable, because when one person controls not just the budget, but the timing of the money, every decision becomes conditional. The first deposits went through smoothly. Venue secured, caterer booked, photographer confirmed. Lily relaxed a little. She told me she felt lucky. She said Vivian was nothing like the horror stories she'd heard. Then the first delay happened. It was small. A catering installment that arrived 3 days late. Vivian apologized casually, blaming a banking issue. She laughed it off and told Lily not to stress. Everything was fine. Except it wasn't. The caterer called me directly, asking whether the payment was still coming. The tone wasn't panicked yet, but it was cautious. I reassured them. I reassured Lily. I even reassured myself. But a pattern doesn't need to be loud to be dangerous. It just needs to repeat. The next delay came with a suggestion. Vivian mentioned that since the menu hadn't been finalized, maybe this was a good moment to rethink it. She wondered aloud whether the original selections felt a bit heavy. She suggested something more refined, more her style. Lily hesitated. She liked the menu, but she also knew the deposit hadn't cleared yet. The caterer was waiting. The clock was ticking. She compromised. That was the first boundary that moved. From there, the delays became more strategic. Always just long enough to create pressure. Always paired with a comment, a preference, a concern about appearances, a reminder of how much Vivian was contributing. Nathaniel brushed it off at first. He said his mother was busy. He said she meant well. He said Lily was overthinking it. But Lily felt it in her body. The constant low-level anxiety, the way every planning meeting felt provisional, the way she stopped feeling excited and started feeling careful. By the time the date itself came into question, she was exhausted. Vivian suggested that moving the wedding by a few weeks might be more convenient for certain guests. Important guests. She didn't demand it. She simply pointed out that flexibility would make everything easier. And once again, a major payment was pending. I watched Lily stare at the calendar, trying to calculate how much of the wedding still existed only in theory. How many contracts depended on money that hadn't arrived yet? How much power she actually had left? Let me ask you this. If someone was paying for your wedding in installments, would you feel supported or trapped? At what point does patience turn into leverage? Because what came next pushed this situation out of the private planning phase and straight into survival mode. Vendors stopped calling politely. They started calling urgently. And Lily realized that this wedding wasn't just being guided. It was being held hostage. The first time Lily tried to push back, she did it gently. She called Vivian to confirm whether the next venue payment had gone through. Not accusatory, not emotional, just a simple check-in. Vivian responded with warmth, told her not to worry, said everything was under control. Then, almost as an afterthought, she mentioned that she'd been reconsidering the floral design. She wondered if something more minimal might feel more elegant, less wasteful. The payment didn't arrive that day, or the next. The venue coordinator contacted me directly, her tone careful but firm. Without the deposit, certain holds would be released. I explained the situation as diplomatically as I could, buying time the only way planners know how. By the time I called Lily back, she already knew something was wrong. She could hear it in my voice. That was the boundary being tested, not with a demand, but with silence. When Lily suggested moving forward with the original floral plan and asked whether payments could be scheduled more predictably, Vivian's tone shifted, still calm, still polite, but colder. She reminded Lily how complicated finances could be, how stressful it was to manage such large sums. She said she was doing her best. Then she said that if planning felt overwhelming, simplifying the wedding might be the smartest choice. The message was clear without being spoken. Cooperation made things easier. Resistance introduced risk. Nathaniel tried next. He called his mother himself and asked, more directly, whether the delays were connected to the changes she kept suggesting. Vivian laughed softly. She told him he was being dramatic. She said she'd never do something like that. Then she added that vendors were expensive and inflexible, and that she didn't appreciate being pressured. The payment arrived later that evening, just in time. After that, the pattern became impossible to ignore. Every major decision came with a delay. Menu changes, decor revisions, even the rehearsal dinner. Each time Lily hesitated, money stalled. Each time she complied, funds appeared. Not immediately, but soon enough to relieve the panic. Lily stopped calling it support. She started calling it survival. She confided in me that she felt like she was planning a wedding on a cliff edge. One misstep, one refusal, and everything could fall away. She slept poorly, she second-guessed every choice. She started asking Nathaniel whether they could afford to scale everything down and pay for it themselves. Nathaniel didn't have an answer. The truth was, the wedding had already grown beyond what they could take back, without losing deposits they didn't control. That's when vendors began applying pressure directly to the couple. The caterer asked Lily whether the guest count was truly final, hinting that smaller numbers might reduce financial risk. The florists suggested simplifying arrangements to avoid last-minute issues. None of them accused Vivian outright. They didn't need to. Everyone understood the vulnerability. The wedding was approaching, and nothing felt secure. Lily told me she felt like she was being trained. Trained to associate peace with obedience, to accept that calm only arrived after she gave something up. And that kind of lesson doesn't stay contained to flowers and menus. Because once uncertainty becomes a tool, it spreads. It starts shaping behavior, not just decisions. What happened next didn't involve another quiet delay. It happened in full view. When the instability that had been hidden behind emails and phone calls finally reached the surface, and the social cost became impossible to contain, the escalation arrived, disguised as logistics. 3 weeks before the wedding, the Vineyard's events director requested an emergency call. Her voice was professional, but there was an edge to it I hadn't heard before. One of the largest remaining payments hadn't cleared, and without it, several services tied to the property would need to be reconsidered. Staffing, equipment, even the ceremony layout. When I hung up, I didn't call Vivian, I called Lily. She answered immediately, already breathless, already bracing. She told me she'd woken up to 2 emails from vendors marked urgent. She said it felt like the ground was moving under her feet. Nathaniel tried again. This time, he didn't soften his words. He asked his mother directly whether the delay was intentional. Whether the money was being used to force decisions. Vivian didn't deny it. She reframed it. She said weddings were fluid, that plans evolve. That she was simply making sure the event reflected the family's standards. She reminded him how fortunate they were to have support at all. And then she said something that landed like a weight on the conversation. She said that if they couldn't trust her judgment, perhaps they should reconsider having such an expensive wedding. The implication was brutal in its simplicity: accept her control or risk losing everything. The payment still didn't arrive. That's when the situation became visible to people outside the family. The venue sent a formal notice, polite but firm. Without confirmation by a certain date, parts of the event would be scaled back. Vendors began copying Lily and Nathaniel on emails that had previously gone only to me. The pressure was no longer subtle. It was structural. Lily broke down in my office that afternoon, not sobbing, just exhausted tears that came from holding herself together for too long. She said she felt humiliated. Not because the wedding might change, but because everyone could see why. She said she felt like an adult, being disciplined in public. Nathaniel sat beside her, silent. For the first time, he looked angry. Not defensive, not confused, angry. He called his mother one last time and told her they were moving forward with the original plans, that if payments didn't arrive, they would find a way to adjust, but they would not keep changing their wedding to chase her approval. Vivian paused. Then she said she hoped they understood the consequences of being ungrateful. The money arrived the next morning. All of it. Too late to undo the damage. Vendors had already adjusted expectations. Trust had already been strained. The calm that followed wasn't relief. It was aftermath. At the rehearsal dinner, the tension sat at every table. People spoke carefully. Conversations circled around logistics instead of celebration. Vivian was gracious, smiling, acting as though nothing unusual had occurred. But the couple moved differently now, more guarded, less open. On the wedding day itself, everything technically went according to plan. The ceremony was beautiful. The vineyard glowed. Guests complimented the details Lily had fought so hard to keep. But beneath the surface, the cost was obvious. Lily flinched every time her phone buzzed. Nathaniel avoided his mother's eyes during toasts. And Vivian watched it all, with a satisfaction that didn't come from joy, but from confirmation. She had proven her leverage, and everyone had seen it. Control achieved through uncertainty doesn't need to last forever. It just needs to be demonstrated once. What lingered after that day wasn't gratitude. It was a quiet understanding of what could be taken away, and how easily, and the real consequence didn't show up in the photos or the schedule. It surfaced later in how Lily and Nathaniel talked about money, decisions, and independence, and in how carefully they chose what parts of their lives Vivian would be allowed to touch. Because when a wedding survives being held hostage, the relationship that follows is never the same. What unfolded after the last guest left wasn't loud or dramatic. It was a recalibration, slow, intentional, and shaped by a single realization that changed how they would accept help forever. After the wedding, Lily didn't feel relieved. That was the first thing she said to me when we met a few weeks later. She told me she'd expected a sense of release once the day was over. Once the payments were settled and the pressure lifted, instead, she felt hollow, like she'd just finished something that had taken more from her than it had given back. Nathaniel felt it too, though he struggled to name it. He said he couldn't shake the memory of how icily everything had been put at risk. How quickly support had turned conditional. The wedding hadn't ended the tension, it had clarified it. Vivian acted as if nothing had happened. She talked about the event proudly, shared photos, told friends how stressful planning had been, and how grateful she was that it all worked out. She never acknowledged the delays, never apologized for the fear they'd lived with. In her version of the story, she had been generous and patient, and the couple had been lucky. Lily stopped trying to correct that narrative. Instead, she started changing her behavior. She and Nathaniel opened separate savings accounts that Vivian didn't know about. They paid for their own moving expenses. They stopped sharing financial plans in advance. When Vivian offered help, Lily smiled and said they had it covered. Those refusals were quiet, but they were firm. Vivian noticed she began making comments about distance, about how independent they'd suddenly become, about how she missed being involved. Each comment carried the same undertone. After everything I've done, but the words didn't land the same way anymore, because Lily had learned something essential. Help that arrives with uncertainty isn't help, it's leverage. And leverage only works when you're willing to keep playing the game. The wedding became a reference point they never spoke about directly but always understood, a shared memory of how quickly stability could be used against them. It changed how they defined security. It changed how they defined family. They didn't cut Vivian out. They didn't confront her. They created distance where it mattered most, financial distance. And that distance gave them something the wedding never did: peace. Before we move on, sit with this for a moment. If someone could make your biggest day feel fragile just by delaying a payment, how safe would any future decision feel? How long would it take before you stopped calling that generosity? Because the last story begins where this one ends, with a wedding that was paid for in full. No delays, no negotiations, no visible strings. Just a gift. And sometimes, the most dangerous control doesn't show itself until after the thank you notes are sent. The third wedding looked perfect from the outside. That's the part that still unsettles me the most. Claire Davenport and Lucas Bennett didn't come to me stressed. They didn't come anxious or defensive or guarded. They came glowing, but calm, almost suspiciously relaxed. And when I learned why, it made sense. Lucas's mother, Ruth Bennett, had paid for everything, not promised to pay, not offered help, paid in full. Up front, every contract signed, every deposit cleared, no conditions, no revisions, no opinions pushed during planning. She called it a gift. She repeated that word often. A gift from the heart. From a mother who only wanted to see her son happy. If you've watched enough of these stories with me, you already know what I was waiting for. But at the time, even I let my guard down a little. The venue was a private luxury resort in Aspen, tucked into the mountains like it had been carved there on purpose. Snow-dusted pines, fireplaces in every common space, the kind of place where silence feels expensive. Ruth had chosen it herself, insisting it was neutral ground. Somewhere special, somewhere worthy. Claire loved it. She told me she felt lucky. She said Ruth had been nothing but warm, supportive, respectful. She didn't interfere with the dress. She didn't touch the guest list. She didn't question timelines or vendors. She showed up to fittings, smiled, paid compliments, and left early. No pressure, no leverage, no red flags. Lucas was relieved. He said this was how his mother was when she was proud, generous, hands-off. He believed this wedding was proof that she trusted him. The planning process was peaceful, and that should have scared me more than it did. On the wedding day, everything ran flawlessly. The ceremony felt intimate despite the scale. Claire cried when she walked down the aisle, not from nerves, but from joy. Ruth sat in the front row, composed, elegant, dabbing her eyes at all the right moments. At the reception, she gave a short toast. Just a few sentences. She welcomed Claire into the family. She said she was happy to give them a strong start. She raised her glass and sat back down. People praised her all night. Guests whispered about how generous she was. Vendors commented on how rare it was to work with someone so decisive and gracious. More than one person told Claire she'd hit the mother-in-law lottery. Claire laughed when she told me that later. She believed it. When the night ended, there was no tension, no confrontation, no quiet tears in hallways. The couple left for their honeymoon the next morning, wrapped in that warm, floating feeling that makes you think everything ahead will be easier than what came before. And here's where I want you to pause with me for a second. Because if you had been there, if you had seen that wedding, if you had watched Ruth pay for everything without once pulling a string, you would have believed it too. You would have thought this was the rare story where money came without control. So did Claire. What none of us understood yet was that the control hadn't been attached to the wedding, it had been postponed. Because the first boundary wasn't tested during planning. It was tested after the thank you notes were sent, when the gift quietly transformed into something else entirely. The boundary was tested before Claire had even unpacked her suitcase. They were 2 days into their honeymoon when Lucas's phone rang. It was Ruth. Her voice was cheerful, affectionate, almost playful. She said she just wanted to check in. She asked how the flight had been, whether the resort met expectations, whether Claire was enjoying herself. Then she mentioned that she'd made a small adjustment. She'd contacted the hotel. She explained it casually, as if it were a favor. She'd arranged a different room for the second half of the stay, one with a better view. More appropriate, she said, given everything she'd done for the wedding. She told them it was already handled, no need to worry. Claire looked at Lucas when he ended the call. She asked why his mother had access to their honeymoon details. He shrugged and said she'd probably gotten them from the travel agent. He said she meant well. That night, when they returned from dinner, their luggage had been moved. No warning, no consent. Just a note at the front desk, congratulating them again and welcoming them to their upgraded suite. It should have felt indulgent. Instead, Claire felt unsettled. She told me later that it was the first time since the wedding that her stomach tightened the way it had during planning meetings with other couples' mothers. She couldn't explain why. She just knew something had shifted. The next call came the morning after that. Ruth asked about their plans once they returned home. She wondered whether they'd thought more about where they would live. She reminded them that she'd paid for the wedding entirely, which meant they didn't have to worry about debt the way other couples did. She suggested that using that freedom wisely would be important. She offered to help with the move. Claire said thank you, but added that they already had an apartment lined up. Ruth didn't argue. She simply went quiet for a beat too long, then said she hoped they weren't rushing into decisions that might limit their future. That word again. Future. When the honeymoon ended, Ruth was waiting. Not at the airport. She knew better than that. She sent flowers to their apartment instead. With a handwritten note welcoming Claire to the family and reminding them how special it was to start married life without financial stress. A week later, she asked for dinner. It was during that dinner that the tone changed. Ruth talked about the wedding in detail. The cost, the logistics, the choices she'd made to make it perfect. She didn't complain. She reminisced. She framed it as storytelling, but each detail landed like a tally mark. Claire noticed that every story ended the same way. With Ruth's involvement, Ruth's decision, Ruth's sacrifice when Claire mentioned a potential job opportunity in another city. Ruth smiled tightly and said she hoped they weren't planning to move too far away after everything she'd invested in keeping the family close. No one raised their voice. No one accused anyone of anything, but the air in the room changed. The gift was no longer a gift, it was a reference point, a quiet, ever-present reminder of who had made their happiness possible. Claire didn't say anything that night. She smiled. She thanked Ruth again. She went home and lay awake staring at the ceiling, replaying the words she couldn't stop hearing in her head. Invested. Because when generosity becomes a ledger, boundaries stop being optional. They become a test of loyalty. And that test didn't end with one dinner. It followed them into every conversation that came next. The escalation didn't arrive as a demand. It arrived as presence. Ruth began appearing everywhere decisions were being made, always framed as concern, always softened by reminders of how much she'd already done. She called before appointments. She followed up after conversations. She remembered details that hadn't been shared with her directly. Claire started to wonder how much of their life was actually private. When Lucas mentioned, in passing, that they were considering a short-term move for Claire's job, Ruth didn't argue. She simply emailed listings in their current city. Expensive ones. Close to her. She wrote that she'd be happy to help with the down payment, especially after covering the wedding so generously. What would you say in that moment? Would you call it interference or kindness? Because that's the trap. Nothing Ruth did was overtly aggressive. Everything could be defended. Everything sounded reasonable. And that made it almost impossible to push back without sounding ungrateful. When Claire declined the offer politely, Ruth reminded her how rare it was to have that kind of support. She said most couples would be relieved. She wondered aloud why Claire seemed hesitant to accept help from family. Lucas stood there, caught between the two women, saying nothing. And silence, in dynamics like this, always takes a side. The wedding came up constantly, not as a complaint, as context, as justification, as proof of devotion. Ruth referenced it when suggesting holiday plans, when questioning travel, when commenting on how often she saw them. Each time, the implication was the same. She had invested in their beginning. She expected access to their future. Claire started measuring conversations by what she could safely share. She edited herself. She stopped mentioning long-term goals. She learned which topics triggered subtle reminders and which ones passed without consequence. Ask yourself this quietly. If every life decision came with a reminder of what someone had already paid for, how honest would you be? How free would you feel to choose? The control tightened when Ruth involved other people. She mentioned to extended family that the couple might be moving, framing it as a worry. She told friends she hoped Claire wasn't pulling Lucas away after everything the family had done to support them. The narrative shifted just enough to cast Claire as the variable. Claire felt it immediately, the looks, the questions, the well-meaning comments about compromise, about gratitude, about remembering who showed up for you when it mattered. At home, the tension grew heavier. Lucas began second-guessing decisions he'd once felt confident about. He worried aloud about appearing selfish. He wondered whether refusing help made them seem cold. The wedding hovered over every discussion like an invisible witness. It wasn't about the money anymore. It was about authority. Ruth didn't need to say she was in charge. She acted as if the wedding had proven it, as if paying for their beginning entitled her to influence every chapter after. And here's the part that makes people uncomfortable. If Ruth had been cruel, this would have been easier to see, easier to reject. But she wasn't cruel. She was generous, and that made the control far more effective. Because how do you confront someone who never raises their voice, never insults you, and never explicitly crosses a line, while quietly stepping over every boundary you try to set? That question haunted Claire. And the answer didn't come in a conversation. It came when the consequences of that control became visible to everyone else, not just inside the marriage. The moment it became public didn't happen at a confrontation. It happened at a family gathering, a casual dinner. Too many people, too little space. The kind of setting where dynamics surface without anyone meaning to expose them. Ruth hosted. She always did. Halfway through the evening, someone asked Claire about work. A simple question. Claire answered honestly, mentioning that the opportunity in another city was still on the table. She hadn't planned to announce it. It slipped out naturally. Ruth smiled before Claire finished the sentence. She said she hoped that wasn't true. She said she would be heartbroken to see them leave, especially after giving them such a beautiful wedding to start their life close to family. She laughed softly and added that it would feel like all that effort had been for nothing. The room went quiet. Not dramatically, just enough. People shifted in their chairs. Someone cleared their throat. A relative nodded sympathetically at Ruth. Another looked at Claire with open curiosity, as if waiting to see how she'd justify herself, and that's when it hit. This wasn't just between them anymore. The wedding had become social currency. Proof of Ruth's devotion, evidence of her sacrifice, and now a measuring stick for Claire's loyalty. Ruth hadn't raised her voice. She hadn't accused Jade, she'd simply framed the story in a way that made everyone else draw the conclusion for her. Claire felt the heat rise in her face. She smiled and said nothing. What could she say without sounding ungrateful? Without sounding like the villain in a story Ruth had already narrated? Lucas noticed it too. For the first time, he didn't stay silent. He said that the wedding had been a gift. That gifts didn't come with expectations. His voice wasn't loud, but it was steady. Ruth looked genuinely wounded. She said she would never hold the wedding over them. She said she was only expressing her feelings. She reminded everyone that she'd wanted nothing in return. And just like that, the room shifted again. Now, Lucas looked harsh, defensive, ungrateful. That's the brilliance of emotional debt when it's weaponized in public. The person asserting independence becomes the problem. The person who paid becomes the victim. After that night, the tone around the couple changed. Comments became loaded. Invitations came with assumptions. Conversations carried undercurrents about closeness, gratitude, and family unity. Claire felt herself being watched, evaluated, measured against a standard she'd never agreed to. Ask yourself something quietly here. If generosity earns someone the right to define how grateful you must be forever, where does that leave your freedom? At what point does appreciation turn into obedience? The wedding was no longer a memory. It was a reference people used to interpret every choice the couple made. And Ruth knew it. She never brought it up directly again. She didn't need to. Others did it for her. Family repeated her concerns. Friends echoed her disappointment. The story traveled without her having to tell it twice. That's when Claire realized something had to change. Not loudly, not publicly, but permanently. Because a debt that exists in other people's minds is far harder to escape than one written on paper. What came next wasn't dramatic. It wasn't explosive. It didn't end with slammed doors or final words. It ended with distance. Intentional, careful, irreversible distance. The distance didn't happen all at once. It started with pauses. With delayed replies, with plans that stayed vague a little longer than usual. Claire and Lucas didn't announce anything. They didn't explain themselves. They simply stopped offering access by default. Ruth noticed immediately. She asked whether everything was okay. She said she felt a shift. She wondered if she'd done something wrong. Her messages were gentle, almost fragile, and for a moment, Claire felt that familiar pull. The instinct to soothe, to reassure, to make things comfortable again. But comfort had become the trap. Claire told me later that what finally changed wasn't anger, it was clarity. She realized that every time she tried to protect Ruth's feelings, she was erasing her own. Every time she stayed quiet to avoid seeming ungrateful, she reinforced a debt she'd never agreed to owe. So she stopped explaining. When Ruth brought up the wedding, Claire acknowledged it once. She said it had been beautiful. She said she was grateful, and then she said something Ruth wasn't prepared for. She said the wedding didn't buy influence, not over where they lived, not over their careers, not over their marriage. The room went still. Ruth didn't yell. She didn't cry. She went quiet in a way that felt colder than either. She said she was hurt. She said she'd only ever tried to help. She said she hoped Claire understood how much that wedding had meant to her. Claire listened. Then she said she understood perfectly. And that was the moment the dynamic broke. Because Ruth expected resistance, or guilt, or reassurance. What she didn't expect was acceptance without submission. After that, the relationship changed shape. Claire and Lucas moved forward with their plans. They took the job opportunity. They chose a city Ruth wouldn't have chosen for them. They paid for their own move. They built a life that didn't require approval. Ruth stayed in contact, but the tone shifted. Invitations became less frequent. Conversations became careful. The reminders stopped, not because Ruth forgot, but because they no longer worked. Control only functions when someone responds to it. The wedding faded into what it should have been all along. A single day. Not a lifelong receipt. Claire once told me that she still loved the memory of walking down the aisle. She still loved the way the mountains looked that afternoon, but she no longer saw the wedding as a gift. She saw it as a lesson, a reminder that money given without boundaries doesn't disappear after the last dance. It waits, quietly, patiently. For the moment, it can be used. When I look back at these weddings now, what stays with me isn't the money or the venues or even the damage that was done in public. It's how familiar the pattern feels every time I see it unfold. 3 different mothers, 3 different styles, 1 rewrote contracts in silence. 1 delayed payments just long enough to cause fear. 1 smiled, paid everything, and waited until the thank you notes were sent. But underneath all of it was the same belief repeated in different languages. That paying for the wedding meant earning a permanent voice in the marriage. I've stood in ballrooms where brides felt like guests. I've taken calls from couples who couldn't sleep because one transfer hadn't cleared yet. I've watched newlyweds realize too late that what they thought was generosity had quietly turned into authority. And every time I hear the same sentence in a different form. After everything I've done, what makes it so effective is that none of these mothers looked like villains. They looked successful, supportive, admired. People praised them. Vendors deferred to them. Guests thanked them. From the outside, they were the heroes of the story. From the inside, they were the authors. As a wedding planner, I'm supposed to focus on logistics, on timelines and contracts and flowers that arrive on time. But after enough weddings like these, you start to see that the real negotiations aren't written down. They're emotional, they're social. And once money enters without boundaries, it doesn't just pay for a day. It starts rewriting roles. I've seen couples recover. I've seen others stay stuck, still paying interest on a wedding that happened years ago. And the difference is almost never about wealth. It's about whether they understood the cost before they accepted the gift. Because control rarely arrives loud. It arrives wrapped in relief, in ease, in someone saying, "Don't worry, I've got it." And if you don't decide early what that means, someone else will decide it for you. If stories like these feel familiar, if you've seen versions of this in your own family or wondered how far generosity should go, you're not alone. These dynamics live in quiet spaces, and they only stay powerful when no one talks about them. So if you want more real, behind-the-scenes wedding stories like this, told from the side of the room most people never see, subscribe and stay with me. And when you think back on these 3 weddings, ask yourself one thing, just for you. Where would you have drawn the line? Before the applause faded,